أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. قال الله تعالى في القرآن الكريم أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين بالقسط شهداء لله صدق الله العظيم. My respected brothers and sisters, honored guests, the principal of IPSA, Sheikh Ihsan Talib, and all the ulama who are present, my very good friend, the inspiration behind the Africa Middle East Center, Brother Imjina. It's great to reunite with you again today, and like this. And to all the panelists, it's always good to be with Sheikh Siraj Hendricks and to share a platform with him. We've agreed to be nice to each other today, he said. And so inshallah, I think it's my second session that I have with Minhaj. And they're always challenging and happily so. And I think that the next generation is really in good hands. If that's the caliber of leaders, and inshallah, I hope inshallah that my children would have a sense of the same kind of values that I think Minhaj has been able to display. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. In the qiraat that we listened to earlier, we saw what I think is the foundational, existential description of the ummah, of the global community of Muslims, that it is ummatan wasatan. It is an ummah, and some, as Sheikh Ihsan has done, has translated wasatan as being justly balanced. Others use what I don't use myself, that wasatan is moderation, is moderate. It looks like the poodles of the West. What I prefer is a definition, a literal definition that I've learned from Ebrahim Musa, that says that wasatan means to be most middlemost. And it is in that literal translation that I think is the most useful description, and that I sometimes believe that if we don't use the literal translation of a global community that is most middlemost, we lose so much meaning. We lose the sense of competing to be in the middle. We lose a sense of resisting to go to the edges. We lose the sense of it not simply being balancing out equations, of it not simply being moderating yourself, but that it is germane to being Muslim that we should be in the middle. Because that is where the best of Islam is to be found, and that is where Islam is to find its most thriving identity. So it is not simply a description of the Ummah, it becomes an instruction to the Ummah to be in the center. And that, the only concession I'll make to fundamentalism, that's the usefulness sometimes of being literal. When we overinterpret, we lose meaning in this case. And so, my job today is not to pronounce on the notion of wasatiyah, but is almost to inversely describe wasatiyah by examining some of the phenomenon on the extremes. And so inversely to say, if those are some of the characteristics, the DNA and the behavioral patterns of the extremes, then we can define what it must mean then also to be in the middle. Because the middle shifts sometimes as the extremes shift. What is the middle between an ISIS and a Trump? And so the point that I'm making is that it is the idea of being most middlemost also allows us to calibrate the middle continuously. It is then an instruction to also be strategic, because that by itself is the opposite of what extremists do. They fix meaning and they allow that meaning to remain ila yawmil qiyamah, till the day of judgment. Whereas the instruction to be most middlemost is to calibrate all the time what the middle is in relation to the extremes as well. And so from that assumption, I would say that the world today is caught up in a vortex of extremisms. And therefore, I want to introduce also the idea that we are not dealing with a single extremism. Because if we get caught up in the notion of a single extremism, it will by definition be Muslim and in the name of Islam or religious. Whereas I think that the idea of competing extremisms in the world today is an important one for us to understand. Each set of extremism, whether Muslim or Western or any other phenomenon, premise their hard and devastating power against their competitors on historical or contemporary victimhood. And so people find a grievance or a point of humiliation sometimes to justify their extremism. And the reason that I started where Sheikh Ihsan started, with the invocation to justice, Kunu qawwamina bil qist, stand out firmly for justice, is because every extremism wants to right an historical injustice with the promotion of justice. And so, extremisms that justify themselves, and sometimes correctly, by their quest for justice, can themselves be capable of being extreme and perpetrating injustice. Because if you freeze the invocation to justice on one ayah, one verse, you may be tempted to think that the value of justice is not only absolute but ultimate. And you begin to not see the value of justice as an intersecting value. Because two subsequent verses that uses the same formulation, Kunu qawwamina bil qist, stand up for justice, are proscribed verses. Because it says, even if it is against yourself. Meaning that there must be introspection, reflection, and the ability to stand up to yourself, those that are near and dear to you, and your own community. And therefore, the sense of justice being an absolute and ultimate value cannot be so. Because it has to intersect with a value of fairness, of being able to see both sides. In a further iteration, it says, and let not the hatred of a people to you make you swerve from justice. Meaning that even if it is true that there is a war against you, that there is an occupation of your lands, that there is an historical commitment, a historical grievance that must be righted, that is not a license to do for justice what you want to do. And so justice is also intersecting with other notions such as mercy, such as withholding, restraint. As you go, and also it intersects with the idea that you don't pursue justice so absolutely that it destroys any basis for peace. And you can't, ipso facto, pursue peace so absolutely that you paper over injustice. And so I think the point that I'm trying to make is that when a movement or a group or a person pursues justice as an absolute ultimate value and not as an intersecting notion, then it is capable, despite the correctness of its intention, it is capable of itself perpetrating injustice and itself becoming an extremist movement. So just because you stand for justice doesn't make you immune to extremism. And so, extremism, therefore, as a phenomenon, is not a faith. It is not an ideology. It is not fixed on a political spectrum, left or right. It is not even a set of ideas. It is a mindset. It is like a virus. It is capable of infecting any faith, any point on the political spectrum, any set of ideas or any ideology. Faith does not have a monopoly of extremism. And so it is a mindset that can find a home in any set of ideas or in any community. And so it manifests when a particular community encounters an historical injustice or a grievance as a quest for justice. When that community is undergoing enormous doubt, when there's great uncertainty, when it reaches the limits of its own thinking and it can't think beyond something to find a new formula, when it's hemorrhaging support, and when it encounters the new and the unexpected and the unprecedented. But simultaneously, it may have closed the doors, excuse the pun, on its own regeneration, on its own ability to think out of the box, the own ability to apply historical principles to new situations, where it's fossilized its source of ideology, and its source of ideology is no longer eternal in time, universal in space, and adaptable to circumstance. Then the reach for extremism is easy. And therefore, what that mindset induces in the new home, ideological, religious, political, or other, economic even, is that it can only reassert the old and the known. That it can only invoke the absence of doubt, provide false certainties. And as the Canadian-born American economist J.K. Galbraith once said, the more uncertain people are, the more dogmatic they become. That uncertainty means that the same truths that's hitting a brick wall, you just assert far more dogmatically and sometimes extremely. And when extremism is lodged in an ideology, a faith, a political behavior and so forth, it in turn displays a set of behaviors. Because extremism can only label because it can't debate. It excludes because it can't embrace. It condemns because it can't forgive. It divides because it can't harmonize. It kills because it can't coexist. And it knows better how to die for a cause than to live for a cause with its nagging doubts and uncertainties. For much of the last few decades, it was thought that religion, and particularly Islam, had a monopoly of extremism and a monopoly of extremist behavior. The West was seen as the exemplar of liberal, secular, tolerant democracy, the bastion of human rights, and Islam was prone in its very DNA to forms of fundamentalism and extremism. I think much has happened in the last while to not only assert but to demonstrate that those within the house of Islam, that proneness still exists, but increasingly you can quantify it as a minority. But it's a powerful one because it is spectacular, whereas the forces of Wasatiyah are boring. It captures the headlines, it captures the Twitter space, it captures social media because it is so dramatic, and the middle ground explains itself in paragraphs and long speeches like this. But the recoil is happening. And we see that recoil beginning to happen as counter-instinctively, for example, American Muslims in the time of Trump are reaching out even to the LGBT community, was the first to rally to their cause when Trump wanted to impose the Muslim ban. What do you do with that? Suddenly all your assumptions are shaken because people that you believe you despise the most are the first to rally to you. What do you do with this uncertainty? When alongside Muslim mosques being desecrated, Jewish graves were desecrated, and the Muslims were first to raise funds for them. And so the recoil against extremism is afoot. 20-page open letters to Baghdadi are being written, making the most compelling theological case, but not in 140 characters. The denunciations, there's elements of denialism in our orthodoxy, but the denunciations at least says not in our name. An alternative theology based on Maqasid Sharia, living Islam by its values and intents rather than simply by its inherited rules and regulations is afoot. I've just come from a conference with 50 ulama in East Africa, all wondering how do we deal with Al-Shabaab, including the muftis of Uganda and the muftis of Tanzania and so forth. There's a search for this alternative religious literacy that is going on. But we all thought, so I'm saying that Muslims have had a few decades to find a formulation and to find their voice, and they're finding it. But as they're finding it, we see the more obtrusive rise of a counter-extremism. I quote for you John Eikenberry from Princeton University, who wrote in the recent Foreign Affairs, and I quote him. He asks, is the world witnessing the demise of the US-led liberal order? If so, this is not how it was supposed to happen. The great threats were supposed to come from hostile revisionist powers. The US and Europe were supposed to stand shoulder to shoulder to protect the gains reaped over the last 70 years. Instead, the world's most powerful state has begun to sabotage the order it created. A hostile revisionist power has indeed arrived on the scene, but it sits in the Oval Office, the beating heart of the free world. Across ancient and modern eras, orders built by great powers have come and gone, but they have usually ended in murder, not suicide. The point that I think John Eikenberry is making is the point that I think we have been making over many years, that an extremism has been evident, building up, and has now become visible in the citadels of the West. And therefore, if some of the things that I've said about extremism in the name of Muslims and Islam, about it labeling and about it killing and so forth, if we use the Muslim manifestations of extremism as documented eloquently, then how would the current ferment in the West measure up? If you look at Brexit, Trump, Le Pen, Alternative für Deutschland, Hungary, and Geert Wilders, and so forth. The key thing is that there is a reaction to globalization in the West. They too now are having to deal with the consequences of a world that is contracting and becoming smaller, where the encounter with the other is no longer a trip you make to exotic places, but it's a trip in which people use the same mobility that has made goods and capital move at the push of a button. Where we see the erosions of certainty, that Americans, for example, who believed that every generation will be better than the one that gave birth to them, that no longer is happening. The loss of power and sovereignty and the increasing need to share it the limitations of militarism and the inability to go and put your military finger in every dike that is cracking. All of those limitations and the dissolution and the dilution of identity as you fundamentally reach a moment to ask, what does it mean to be British today? Is it Anglican praying, English speaking, monarch worshipping, fish and chips eating phenomenon, Anglo-Saxon phenomenon? Clearly, curry has become much more the cuisine of the day. You see far more Caribbeans and Pakistanis and Indians and people from all over the world in London today. And so this is the phenomenon, and when the problems you've wrought in another part of the world comes crashing over your borders to haunt you, you suddenly have a demographic mix that defies the era of the birth of the nation state. And so, how did this phenomenon of Trump and Brexit and Wilders and Le Pen and so forth? Because the point is, if we quantified the number of extremists in the name of Muslims and Islam, we will probably count 40,000 foot soldiers in Raqqa. We will probably count pockets and cells in different places. We'll probably look at a quantifiable number in Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab. But what do you do when 46% of Americans voted for Trump? When 33% of the French voted for Le Pen? When Wilders gained 20 seats, the only one who rose in Holland? Where Hungary has a president making the laws that shows his commitment to this extremism. What do you do when 51.9% of British people voted for Brexit? You're not dealing with pockets and cells and military camps. You're now dealing with a mainstreamed extremism. They sit in parliaments, they sit in the White House, they command militaries, they've got fingers on the nuclear buttons. This is unprecedented in terms of what we have seen done in the name of Islam with suicide vests and trucks and knives and the range of other materials of terror. And so the point that I'm making is, this is the counter-extremism taking office. And therefore the notion of a vortex of extremisms has never been as real as it is today. And so we need to look at the conveyor belt to understand how did we suddenly find ourselves with a Trump and with a Brexit and so forth, and the changing natures on the other side of the equation of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Al-Shabaab, and Boko Haram, and so forth. I would say that the first point on that continuum is the notion of uncertainty that has, as J.K. Galbraith said, given rise to greater dogmatism. And it's very important to understand this because, like the elements of the scientific table, there are elements which are inert that require something for it to become active. And when, for example, speaking to the ulama that we gathered in Geneva from Molenbeek, Saint Denis in Paris, Tunisia, Morocco, and so forth. One of their reactions when we spoke about this conveyor belt that starts with uncertainty and ends up with terrorism, one of them said, Astaghfirullah, God forgive me, I may have contributed to it when I too was uncertain. And the point of the matter is that unless one looks at the whole conveyor belt from uncertainty to terrorism, what we preach on a Friday and what we condemn in a statement on the Monday after an attack may appear dislocated, but may in fact be part of a continuity. Because you cannot preach intolerance to women and hope that it won't rub off on Westerners and Americans and so forth. Just like Trump is going to understand that you can't preach intolerance towards Muslims and not have a reaction from African Americans and Hispanics and so forth. Because that's the nature of intolerance. It's like water. It goes into every nook and cranny. It's not a solid that you can put on top of something and it stays put. And so, part of it is to understand how it moves from that uncertainty and then becomes a fundamentalism. And some of us have been proud to share in the term. If fundamentalism is returning to the fundamentals of my faith, then call me a fundamentalist. You're just adding the next layer. You're just adding the next layer over uncertainty to assert fundamental truths, whether they are eternal, universal, and adaptable. You're teaching that mindset to your students, to your congregations, and to your citizens. This illusory certainty, harking back to an idealized past where things were great. And so, it's not immediately pernicious, it's still inert. It's just in the mind still. And then, the next iteration is that it moves from fundamentalism to extremism. Because fundamentalism can make you retreat. You see, this world is terrible. Just like the Midwest of the United States went into the silent majority, going into the evangelical churches, getting their welfare, just like the silent majority who came out for Brexit, mobilized by the anger that the time is now. We've got the mobilizer. They were inert. Thank you, Rich. And so the point that I'm making is that when we then see the movement from fundamentalism to extremism, they now no longer think, I will retreat from the world. They now begin to say, I will reshape the world. I will transform the world in my image. My image is right. Justice becomes judgment. Now I will change the world. And then it normally happens, that transition, when they can plug into power. The vacuums of Afghanistan, the political vacuums of Afghanistan created the Taliban. The territorial vacuums and political vacuums of Iraq, of Syria, have created the power plug, because fundamentalism walks around with its plug looking for a power source. And the inert becomes the active when they find the power source. Just like the fundamentalists in the US and in Europe have been waiting for that power source for 50 years. Sometimes they've had flashes like the war on terror. Sometimes they've had flashes like Tony Blair has described. But the fact of the matter is, now they believe that they found the power source, and it's a matter of time. And then, when the power source is complete and the switch is on, it can make its further transition from extremism, which is the realm of propagating ideas of intolerance, of hostility, of aggression, of exclusiveness, anti-other, etc., anti-immigration. It now gets the wherewithal to terrorize people, to build walls, to ban Muslims, to bar foreigners, to launch missiles to foment war. It now has the wherewithal. And so we need to understand what are those precursors, so that this notion of dealing with extremism as a security threat is the falsest notion that you can find, because it is the national security equivalent of plugging in to that power source that gives you the command of the state to curtail freedoms and to deal with the other in pernicious ways and to create aggression and war in the world. And so I end by reiterating that we need to understand both the economics, and truly there are economic conditions that have worsened for people across the world, including in South Africa, but also in the Midwest, also in Europe. The loss of jobs, the loss of income, the lowest percentile of United States citizens have had their income since 2007 declined by 20%. The only people who have been the graduates whose incomes have increased by 17%. It is a universal story. Ours is difficult in South Africa because it's color-coded and part of our legacy and tainted by corruption. That makes it even more unpalatable. But with that comes the exploitation of identity, the assertion of false identities. Before we all, even Muslims, we formed our identities on the positive values. I believe in the Tawheed of Allah. I follow the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I read the Quran. Our identities were formed positively. Now we form our identities in contradistinction to the other. We are different from them. Sometimes it's the internal other. I'm not a Shia. I'm not a Sufi. I'm not a modernist. And then we also form it externally. At least I'm not black. I'm not American. I'm not Jew. But not only is it distinction, it is contradistinction. You also identify yourself against the other. You are different and against. And that's why I will now issue a fatwa against the Shias. I will now issue a fatwa saying, or I will make a khutbah saying that Hadat is bid'ah. And I will do all of these different kind of things. And we have also perfected, and it's one of my big pick-up points on arriving back in Cape Town after 7 years, that this mainstream community that is the hope of the Muslim world is succumbing to not terrorism yet, not extremism yet, but I think we're entering a phase of fundamentalism in which the key words of intellectual tyranny has become bid'ah and kufr. And we've got to watch out, because whenever we don't understand something, we suspend scholarship and we say it's bid'ah, it's an innovation. And that could be a death sentence in any other place. We say it is kufr, and that could be, it is non-Islamic, anti-Islamic, and that could be a death sentence in a volatile world. And therefore I think that we now must understand how we are in a world of competing extremisms. And so how do we take that fight? Collapsing the extremism within while opposing the extremism without. Stand up for justice, even if it be against yourself. That is the test of authenticity, the test of credibility, and so often we fail it because we can do external opposition, but we are often cowed because we share the mosques with the people who can harm us. We speak to the people who can harm us. We see their faces in the crowd and we temper and edit our words. It is better then to keep projecting on the far enemy and ignore the internal enemy. but they mutually reinforce each other. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.